Thank you for the invitation to present today. I will start by giving honor to the Tongva people whose land I currently occupy, also known as Long Beach, California. One of our own organizational practices of racial equity is naming of Indigenous land. Land acknowledgement is a way that we insert an awareness of Indigenous presence in our everyday life. So as Denzel mentioned, I work with Dr. Manuel Pastor here at University of Southern California, and our organization's research bridges the academy with the work of community organizations. Our research in immigration and racial justice looks at the intersections of race, gender, class, immigration status, and really connects the dots for the people we interview and write about. So today I will connect some of those dots in my presentation. So a quick overview of my presentation. I'll talk a little bit about the data I'm using, defining racial equity, looking at the US population by race and ethnicity, immigrants by race and ethnicity, the changing demographics, some social vulnerabilities, and then end with some strategies. And so the data set that I'm using is from what we call the National Equity Atlas. And this is a collection of information from the American Community Survey and the US Census data. I highly recommend this as well, along with the resource that Denzel mentioned. It's very user-friendly, and it even allows you to download a JPEG picture of the data you need, which you can easily copy and drop into a presentation. So giving a little bit of a definition on racial equity, I'm sure many of you have seen definitions, and this is just a sampling and how we at CSII define racial equity, ensuring that just and fair inclusion into our society in which everyone can participate and prosper. And also a big part of our work is also combating anti-Black racism. And so giving a macro overview of Black folks in the US, and the totals here include both US-born and foreign-born that identify with a particular immigrant ethnicity as well. You may not be able to see the details, but it also disaggregates by ethnicity. So for example, over 2.2 million Black folks are from the Caribbean living in the US, and 2.6 million are from the continent of Africa. Since our host Denzel is from Trinidad, I want to highlight there are over 143,000 Trinidadians in the US. And similarly with the Asian American folks in the US, here you can see the majority of folks, 5.6 million are East Asian from countries like China, Japan, and Korea, and 4.8 million come from Southeast Asia from countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, etc. And so the next two slides, I really want to talk a little bit about some definitions and some words I may use interchangeably for Black and African American, for example. It's been an issue in the community, and really folks, I would identify folks how they want to be identified. So if folks prefer to be called African immigrants or Black immigrants or Caribbean immigrants, I would offer that you let folks make that choice. And also really talking a lot about anti-Blackness, which is something that we see in the world and even in our own organizations. I offer you this definition that voids Blackness as a value while systemically marginalizing Black people. So moving on, as we talked about what the percentage of immigrants are in America, 14%. I know many people, if you look at other news, might think it's a lot more than that. So you can see that this curve started with, a shift over the years, right? From the 1970s, moving all the way up to where we are now, that steadily increase of 5% over the last few years. Another way to look at this is to looking at how long folks are in the US, and you can see here that over the years, folks have been here for more than 10 years. Today, we have folks in the US for over 30 years. So the current pattern is that, again, immigration has slowed down because there are some long settled folks. And speaking of long settled and more settled communities, we can see, again, this presentation will be shared, not to worry, so you can see more clearly up close what the cities are that are represented. But the top 5 cities with the settled immigrant communities are California, Vermont, Maine, Arizona, and Rhode Island. Many of you in the webinar are from New Hampshire and Connecticut, and you can see where your states have over 60% of immigrants settled in your communities. And one reason could be that there may not be a lot of new immigrants there because there's not as many opportunities for work as they are in some other countries like the South Dakota and so forth. I'll move along a little bit more quickly. Here we can see the changing demographics, right? The US is changing, where the white population was 69% in 2000, and by 2050, it'll be 47% or less. You can also see how this has a direct correlation to the uprising of white nationalist groups across the country. You can also see the steady increase of Latinos over the next few decades. Looking at the difference between immigrant and US born by race, this data is from 2015. For example, the green part of the pie shows 1.2 Asian Americans born in the US and 3.2% are immigrants. And if I can disaggregate that a little bit further, you can see the immigration growth a little bit clearer here. The gray lines are the number of Black immigrants. From 1990 to 2000, those numbers increased by over 700,000. And then from 2000 to 2015, those numbers increased by over 1 million. So it tells us that immigration is becoming more important for Black migrants. If you look at the chart for the Latino immigrants, the increases here from the 1990s to the 2000s is 2.7 million. However, we see the decline, right, from 2000 to 2015, but the number of US born Latinos have doubled. So let's connect some dots here. The popular narrative is that Latinos are mostly immigrant, and that's just not true. Most are US born based on the data collected. So we have to continue to use data to strengthen the narratives for communities we serve. And the last one I'll look at is the Asian American population of US and immigrants born. 1990 to 2000, you see it grew by 300,000. And then the following years, from 2000 to 2015, the increase was over 1 million. Again, I encourage you to think about the narrative you hear or repeat about what certain groups of immigrants look like in the US. So as we think about intersections within immigration, we have to consider how social vulnerabilities play out. Now that we are in the time of COVID-19, we are more attuned to vulnerabilities and how our immigrant population is affected. And I'm sure you will hear more about that from other presenters as it relates to health equities. So for the purpose of this presentation, as it relates to data, social vulnerabilities refers to the characteristics of a person and indicators that are captured in the data. So the indicators could be race, gender, immigration status, socioeconomic status, abilities. And when I say neighborhood environment, I'm talking about climate change and how they're affected by climate change. So giving you an example of immigrants by gender and rate and age, we can see that 30% are women between the ages of 35 and 49 years old. So how might this consideration change or enhance your work? If we look at another example of immigrants in the environment, a climate gap research conducted in California showed that the greenhouse gases emission facilities are located in disadvantaged communities where many of our immigrant families live. They also suffer high mortality rates exposed to higher air pollution levels. So I want to close by just sharing 6 strategies for collective action when working with our immigrant communities. The first is to build a more inclusive immigration movement. And really, I'm thinking specifically to address race, racism, and discrimination, to interrupt any anti-Blackness among immigrant serving organizations, to address Black immigrant leadership gap, and really to create broader policy agendas that address the needs of Black and other migrants, right? So that's the first strategy. The second strategy is to promote immigrant integration. And examples of targeted strategies, for example, with Black migrants, you could do a Know Your Rights training to counter police violence. With the Asian Pacific Islander immigrants, you can do educational classes, perhaps in API appropriate languages. A third strategy is to increase your visibility and rigor by partnering with research centers, as we mentioned earlier, either my own, the ones that are going to be on this webinar, for example, disaggregating your data to help immigrants feel seen, storytelling in your narratives, and really clearly identifying the issues. The fourth strategy, to promote and incorporate equity into everything, really wanting you to establish clear goals and practices and outcomes, make sure that there's an element of equity in all of your policies, and evaluate everyday practices that your organization is engaged in. Five, uh, build strong relationships with a network of community organizations. And this would help fill in the gaps at city or community, or I'm sorry, county agencies. It would help reach diverse communities, and it would help you keep the pulse on the ground. And lastly, as we've been talking about, really practicing intersectionality and a willingness to network with other movements. So bridging gaps between networks, which will eventually build streams of social movements that become a river of change. So whether we're talking about the reproductive justice movement, the environmental justice movement, the economic justice movement, racial justice, immigrant movement, all of that would equal a river of change for impacted people. And so moving the needle, here are some examples of organizations using a racial equity lens in their immigrant organizing. So highlighting Undocu Black Network, or highlighting African Communities Together, or BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Of course, the Immigrant Learning Center, the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity also is an organization that really embraces a lot of different social movements, right? So if you're familiar with others that are really lifting up a racial equity lens, I would invite you to throw those into the chat so I could add them to my PowerPoint for the future and really circulate those names, right? So thank you for listening. And if you want more information about the data that I presented, please look, here's my information, my email, and my address. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim Tabari. One question before you sign off for a few minutes before you rejoin us for the discussion. Describe how Black Lives Matter got involved in immigration. Why and how?
Right. Well, I was part of Black Lives Matter for much longer than I was in the movement of what I'm doing now in the immigration movement. And for us, all Black Lives Matter, right? So whether whether you're an immigrant, whether you're trans, whether you're queer, whether it's Black women or Black men. And so we really want to build an inclusive movement right off the bat that really highlights all of our Black lives mattering. And I know in certain spaces, there's this like, you know, folks want to divide the issues and sort of play oppression Olympics, right? It's like, oh, but Black people are getting shot on the street, but we're talking about immigration. And it's sort of like, we're not gonna compare the issues. We're not gonna play oppression Olympics. Like we're all seen as Black when we're in this country. And so it's really important to have that lens.
It's not historically been an easy road, Black communities and immigrants. We learned from Dr. James Jennings at Tufts in a previous webinar, the long history of unions and other stakeholders pitting those two groups together. And do you see, generally speaking, across the US, a mending of those relationships?
I do. I mean, I think the movement for Black Lives is doing a lot of work, bringing in voices from all the different movements. You know, just tomorrow, I know that they're hosting an event on hearing from Black voices on climate change, for example, right? And so, you know, folks don't want to put one particular issue that Black folks can talk about, but it's like, no, we're not a monolithic group that can only talk about one thing. And, you know, we want to talk about all the issues that affect Black people in this country. So whether we're talking about climate change, or whether we're talking about reproductive justice, or whether we're talking about immigration, like all of these issues intersect. Because if you're thinking about the individual and not about the movement, then it's clear to see that we're talking about people's humanity and people's dignity. And so we're not really parsing it out.